and let us all do we can to build a better future.
Okay, so yeah, we have a story I thought was really interesting because this is the exact kind of evolution I do like seeing with protests. I know we've covered a number of protests, pretty much ongoing as part of Hardlands Media, and in this case, this is about the Seattle protests. And because I like all the terms that we're throwing in for the show. The Chaz, that was a that was Fox News ran with that, and they ran and they ran and they ran and they ran. And here we have what I like to call like the other side of this, which is people are actually evolving how to deal with these situations. Because, me and Kid have covered a number of protests where, we go there and they get a bunch of people together, a few hundred people, maybe a few thousand people together, and then they march for 4 or 5 blocks, and then they go in a cattle pen and they yell at Trump Tower and nothing gets accomplished. Meanwhile, we have other organizations which it's maybe 5 or 10 people working diligently, strategically over months and unlocking $10 million in support for local communities by doing that. And I think that those distinctions are what we as progressives should be looking at these groups and calling them out on. If you see a group, once people can go in groups again, in more than just a few protest groups, let's make sure that they actually are accomplishing something. And this story gets to the heart of that. So, on the 6-month anniversary of the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, some protesters said the constant citywide demonstrations that have occurred in Seattle since the death of the Minnesota man are evolving locally. I really like, again, branding. I like the term evolving. I protest less, said David Lewis, who organized many of the mainstream rallies last summer in Seattle. I've been reading up on local law and legislation, and I'm making sure that I stay as informed as possible. I think that a lot of people are in this taking that way as well. Lewis said he's seen a shift to more informed activism while stressing that protesting will always thrive in Seattle. The protest is the physical manifestation of change, but there's a lot of work that has to be done in the background. I think that is immensely important to take as a consideration. This is just the evolution. Even if you just heard of the protests, if you thought they were protests, were in the protests with us, I encourage you to take that next step. It's the key point that protesting is just a manifestation of a feeling and a determination and something that you want to accomplish, but you can't really accomplish anything just protesting. You have to do other things to make it effective, to make it a push. So, as we continue, I encourage you to take the next step. Realize policy is where change is. That's exactly right. That's exactly the point. Protest should be a means of affecting policy in a lot of the ways, the same way war is. That you don't just go to war. People that just go to war, or countries that just go to war, are making horrible mistakes. But if you have a strategic objective you're trying to accomplish, in the U.S.'s case, which is usually just a lot of oil, they're using that military might to effect a change. Even though that's maybe not the perfect comparison for the story I'm reading, I'm going to continue anyway. On the day after Thanksgiving, dozens of protesters took to Seattle streets to call for fair pay and better working conditions for employees. See, this is good, calling something specific. We want to see Jeff Bezos pay his fair share of taxes, and each and every fulfillment center in every 50 states. Jason Anthony, a former employee. This really makes me happy to read a story like this, because I just, as much as I support protests, and whenever we see them and cover them, we're like, these people are trying to make a difference, and I want that feeling to propagate. Again, you have to do more than that. So people that are in these protests need to be making lists, collecting names of people there, figuring out who's in what voting districts, coordinating people together on certain topics, leveraging that against aldermen, in our case, because we have a council people that are in many other places, or whatever they call themselves, wherever they are, and then force them, or try to force them to, maybe not, if they can't adopt everything, adopt most of the things you want, and then you turn around and you support them in the election. And then if they don't follow through with what you're doing, because it's on a local level much easier to make this happen, you then get someone to replace them. You find one of your own organizers who you know will follow these key issues. You put them against them. You will use the already existing power of the group that you've already put together, and you use them to help elect that new person. And so the response that you get from politicians is if they see you protesting and they go, I can ignore you and eventually you'll go away and I can do whatever I want, I'll continue to do whatever I want, you've completed an ineffective protest. But if you do that protest and you do all these other things, the guy in the next district over might go, I might have to take these guys a little bit more seriously. Because at the end of the day, it's all about becoming a key supporter. And if they need you to get reelected, or conversely, you're supporting someone else will get them to not be elected the same way that corporations do, but from a people's point of view, that's how you win locally. And then that can propagate outward. But we have to make sure we do those steps.
Yep.
Yeah, I
Kira.
was really heartened actually by this article as well, because it does sound to me like the protests in Seattle are, even though they thinned out in numbers, a lot of times the numbers don't necessarily matter as much. What matters is the fact that there is an initial demand in the protest. So if you just go out in protest with rage and you don't have actually initial demands, the protest is a little useless. But then also protests need to create tension for leaders. It needs to make leaders uncomfortable. And I do see that happening in Seattle with their leaders and some of the changes, while maybe, not everything that they've wanted, certainly present for them and in conversation. Now, I wanted to also share something because I'm taking a course right now in trauma healing for frontline activists. And I wanted to share a movement cycle graph just to kind of demonstrate or display what it actually looks like to create change through protest. I hear a lot of people who aren't involved in movements say, like, what's the point of this? What's the use? Nothing ever gets done. And, a lot of times we get that sense only because there is an entire cycle that these movements go through. And it is a cycle. It keeps going up and down, up and down. So, initially, there's a declining, and persistent condition of oppression, right? And then there's a dramatic event that triggers action. And then there's massive numbers of people who become mobilized. And then, the movement then becomes widely recognized. Arguments start penetrating mainstream discourse, like we're seeing happen with so many things right now. And then there's backlash by the state media, reactionary elements of the public, like what we're talking about with our first story inside of Defund the Police. But there's so many, Black Lives Matter, that, remember when that came out and how not supported that was. And now you look at the term Black Lives Matter, and a majority of Americans support that terminology. That took years. And then again, the movement starts to build. And then this is, I think, more of the phase, Daniel, of what you're pointing to, where there's a lot of like back end action. There's a lot of things going on that are a little bit more behind the scenes. And, then actual change can start to be created. But there is a whole cycle that gets involved with this that I think that if we're more aware about it as a population, we can start to see where we fit into those cycles, right? So if you enjoy that like big crowd stuff, great, go and be a part of that. If that's not your deal, there is a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes in actually creating change. And there's a place for everyone. But I think the other piece that this cycle points out and really illustrates for me personally is that we do need everyone, because there are so many moving parts. So I just wanted to share that with our audience because I thought that was pretty interesting.
I thought that was great. I think that chart that we just had up was really, I really like charts like that. It's exactly it. Because it's like, when we were talking about specifically the protests that we thought were a bit ineffective when we covered them, Those again were literally people that would start at whatever that square is in the city, and they would walk, and then they would turn, and then they would literally cattle pen themselves. And their entire point of their protest was, we're going to get Trump impeached. That didn't work out. I mean, very ineffective. And they committed in all the protests we covered and the ones we didn't, just maybe over 100,000 human hours of commitment and a decent chunk of money to make those protests happen. And like I've been saying, like, what would be like a really effective way? Like, here's a good way to get things accomplished if you're protesting. Don't do that first. Don't let yourself be put in a cattle pen that the police built for you. It's just really bad optics in my point of view. But second, that same amount of people that they had, they usually had like, 1,000 to 2,000. I think, Kira, you might have been in a couple of those rallies as too with us, but I don't.
Oh, I've been to so many rallies.
Yeah.
It's so funny.
Yeah, there's been
Daniel,
a lot.
I'm
It's
just
a
like,
blurring of flat fact. I forget which ones we were at now.
Yeah, but my point is, you could take 2,000 people and not march into a cattle pen. Instead, have groups of, split them up, get a leader, meet in maybe a central spot, and then split up with leadership leading every single group, and go. So for people that are in Chicago, this is going to make a lot more conceptual sense than people that aren't, but you'll kind of understand it anyway. Just get 100 people. Plop them sitting right in the intersection that the Eisenhower ends on, and then put another 100 people in the intersection next to it, and then keep going all the way till you're at Lakeshore Drive. That is putting a lot of pressure on the city of Chicago when you cut the entire city in half, isn't it? Except for Lakeshore Drive. Not for Lakeshore Drive, except for Wacker. That's the same people that you could have, instead of walking to a cattle cage, that could just kick the entire city into stop. It would cost the city millions. It would cost businesses millions. And then have something that you can say, like, if Trump comes to the city, I don't want the mayor to meet with him. That's a demand. Yeah. And then when you say that, people say, hey, can you just like get these people to stop by agreeing to this? That's something that can be effective. Then further, if you don't like Trump, try and get people to vote in the election in states where he won. Go to swing states. I mean, think and build those the background pieces, because it's. I mean, I'd say the same thing, but it's just, I find it so important to have stuff behind the scenes. Can you imagine us trying to run this show like we did back then? Because back then we were a lot like that. We were just going from protest to protest, covering everything. Yeah,
that's not happening.
But we didn't have anything to actually do. We covered these protests in way more detail, perhaps, but 20 people saw it, versus we can talk about it now and 1,000 people will see it. And it's like, I want to do both. COVID's happening right now, but I think that chart really got me excited.
Yeah. I'm very glad you shared that, Kira. And I think if anything, a phase, if we can update that to put it in our show notes, that'd be really good to share with people, because I think people need to see that. Again, you could check out our show notes in the description box below. But as a final note for this story, because, look, I'm a fan of seeing like large numbers of people, here's what happened with the pandemic passing, then, people protesting and making their voices heard and bringing in real fundamental change. But you don't need a grand army. I can give a perfect example. Myself, Daniel, and Kira were part of Wolfpack, Illinois. And we got Illinois to become the third state to call for an Article 5 convention proposing a constitutional amendment to get money out of politics. 23 people, at least 23, 25 people I know of, that me and Daniel and Kira know of, participated in that organization in Wolfpack, Illinois. We got our state involved, and we got the Illinois Democratic Senate and House to vote for it. That means we even got Michael Madigan, Speaker of the House, longest serving Speaker of the House in any state history, to vote yes for it. And Illinois became the third state and became the first state in a long time to be recognized by the United States calling for a constitutional convention. It can be done, and we need to fight for that better future now more than ever.